In this video, I'm going to dive deep into an often unexamined emotion that, if left unscrutinized, it ensures that we remain stuck to our past. Unexamined guilt and undifferentiated guilt can cripple our ability to think critically and rationally. We lose common sense as guilt traps us in the past, and we ruminate and agonize over all our transgressions. And if we're not aware of it, it can be easily triggered by others, activated within us, and then it spreads like wildfire. But most destructive of all is how guilt can sabotage our healing and our ability to feel worthy of love, abundance, and success. Guilt is an emotion that can lurk in our shadow, and by that I mean we don't want to look at it. We avoid it or we minimize it, hoping it'll go away. Many people repress these darker aspects by wearing a mask of hyperpositivity. But bringing it to light, to our own conscious awareness, takes away the intensity and guilt's control over us. It's exhausting to pretend to ourselves that we don't feel something. It costs us big time, and both our mental health is affected and eventually our physical health is too. In fact, the emotion of guilt is probably one of the biggest causes of psychosomatic illness. And I'll explain all of this to help you consider how this might still be influencing your behavior today and possibly impeding you on your path toward authenticity. So I'm going to unpack some of the confusion surrounding guilt. It's a very complex emotion, and it's not necessarily a destructive emotion, but for victims of narcissistic abuse, it can become all-consuming and trigger the worst in us, and left unexamined, it can sabotage our healing and progress. Excessive guilt can also destroy our self-esteem and creativity. And yeah, sure, the narcissist made us feel guilty, and often guilt was the main weapon of their manipulation. But I also want to address how we still continue to unnecessarily torture ourselves when we allow this programming to run riot in our mind indiscriminately. If we don't scrutinize this self-defeating program, we can become trapped replaying endless scenarios from our past that only destroys all the goodness that we have in front of us today. Guilt is almost like an energetic virus that infects us. It can be really subtle if we're not aware of it. It's a very dark, heavy emotion to bear, and it can trigger you, causing you to spiral back to the past. And people who've survived narcissistic abuse often have a generalization about guilt. We are more prone to feeling shame and anxiety. We easily take the blame and more readily direct anger at ourselves inwardly. And these are all signs of someone who's experiencing an undifferentiated guilt. And by undifferentiated, I mean when you don't know that there are different types of guilt. There is a positive aspect to guilt. When we feel guilt, it is an emotion that lets us know that we've done something wrong. You've made a mistake. You've committed a misdeed. Your conscience sounds an alarm. Something's gone amiss according to your ethics and morals. So then we can apologize, make amends, fix things. So guilt's main function is to maintain standards of right and wrong. But most of all, to learn from our mistake so then we don't repeat it again. And that is the purpose of guilt. However, we are often completely unaware when we are suffering from an unwarranted sense of guilt, when we are seeking to punish ourselves, when we're caught in a web of secret hostile thoughts, which is like launching a psychological attack on our own body. We tend to have an excessive and often unwarranted type of guilt. That means we feel guilty when it's not warranted. There's no real or justifiable reason. It might be something we've made up because we are seeking to punish ourselves, and it's fueled by a lot of negative thinking when we ruminate, agonize over something that did or did not happen, and this causes our stress hormones to go through the roof. Our guilt is often out of proportion to the severity of the supposed wrongdoing. In our minds, we lose sleep, suffer in this debilitating mental state for months or years, replaying, I should have, I could have, if only. It's a loop that can control our mind and waste the precious time we could be spending more productively. It can include catastrophic thinking, focusing only on the negative. We judge ourselves really harshly, or we compare ourselves. So guilt quietly undermines the quality of our lives if we don't do this internal assessment for ourselves. We let guilt run AWOL and don't have the inner self-discipline to stop by telling ourselves no amount of guilt can change the past. So this neurotic and irrational type of guilt can have a very oppressive effect. We need to take self-responsibility for what we are still allowing to replay in our mind and assess whether it's justifiable and take appropriate actions so guilt loses its control over our lives. And it's also another opportunity to realize that emotions don't control us, but we control our emotions. Self-inflicted guilt is often about our attachment to the past. We torment ourselves. We struggle with self-acceptance and surrendering. And it's about our attachment to how we wish things could have been. And you'll probably notice that it's a lot easier for us to forgive others than to extend that same compassion and forgiveness and love to ourselves, perhaps towards our younger selves, a more innocent version of ourselves who truly did not know any better. So guilt can become quite toxic when we feel an unreasonable amount of guilt for something that's beyond our control. And guilt and toxic shame can also become a blur for us. So toxic shaming is when someone dumps or shed their own feelings of shame onto you. So they don't want to own it, so then they dump it on you, an unsuspecting, loving person who just wants everyone to feel good, who usually has low self-worth, and that can be an extremely draining experience. People who are psychologically immature, psychopaths who don't have a conscience, and narcissists who are deficient in empathy will have trouble with sensing this inner alarm, which is guilt. That's why expecting them to say sorry is as good as impossible, because you need to feel guilt. It's meant to inspire you to apologize for wrongdoing. So if they can guilt trip you and get you to take responsibility for what they did wrong or should be feeling guilty about, and if they can emotionally blackmail you with guilt, getting you to do or not do something, then what you have there is the manipulative use of an emotion that can control another person. Well, it can control that person until they wake up to what's really going on. Let's just do a quick reality check here to ease some of your guilt. If you are in a relationship with a narcissist or psychopath, chances are you did 90% of the work in that relationship. Most likely, it was you who put in most of the effort to salvage this relationship, to restore peace, to preserve sanity, to help them. You contributed your time, your effort, your finances. So stop yourself from energetically hemorrhaging and use your discernment to put guilt in its rightful place. You need to ask yourself, how easily can you be controlled by guilt? Do you know where your boundaries are? Do you know what you're responsible for and what the other person is responsible for? Another important thing I'd like to address is that narcissists often can manipulate us into doing things that violate our own ethical and moral codes. And they know that this will cause us to feel tremendous guilt that will torture us for a really long time. They won't flinch, lying, cheating, or engaging in criminal activity, but if they manage to con us into being their accomplice, our conscience will bother us, whereas there'll be very little repercussions for them. And you'll notice that they'll bring up this little secret at an opportune time because they know guilt is an emotion that they can control you with easily. If you've been with someone who uses guilt to motivate you to do something or not do something, and if it happens often enough and you actually start believing that everything is your fault and you're to blame, you'll develop a tendency to automatically misinterpret things. You won't even consult your logic. You'll just go straight into self-blame and repeat it often enough. This is what happens to us. We carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, or the weight of the narcissist's irresponsibilities on our shoulders like a backpack. For those of us who feel guilt about how we didn't do enough in the relationship to help this person, to understand them, we weren't patient enough with them, etc., etc., we eventually develop what psychologists call compassion fatigue, which can be defined as burnout. It's when we nominate ourselves to be their professional helpers. Compassion fatigue is commonly a problem for healthcare professionals, but also those who develop a preoccupation with alleviating the emotional stresses of others. And I think you'll recognize this now. It's when we don't even realize we've become preoccupied with caring for and saving and helping the narcissist, who eventually you realize has no intention of changing, who wants to remain the victim and siphon all your resources to the point of physical exhaustion and emotional depletion. And this person becomes our project instead of our partner, instead of our parent. So all I'm saying is be aware if you recognize this very covert relationship dynamic. And a really interesting definition that I found of compassion fatigue that will really ring true for a lot of people is that it's also known as secondary traumatic stress. It's a condition characterized by a gradual lessening of compassion over time. So we're basically chronically giving, excessively giving, so it can be basically defined as the cost of caring for others. And this is really important to recognize within yourself. It makes us extremely irritable, we feel easily annoyed, and then we judge ourselves and feel guilty because we simply just cannot care anymore, or we care less than we ever have before. And perhaps from yet another, more spiritual perspective, we can see how long-term relationships with narcissists who intentionally seek out to exploit our compassion and siphon our energy, kindness, and goodness, it can be perceived as tampering with our life purpose or stalling our soul's evolution. If we don't wake up, they'll make themselves our life's orbit. And the end result is that we're so emotionally exhausted that we simply have hit rock bottom with our ability to care, and we feel a deep sadness because we may have had great dreams of contributing to humanity or volunteering to charitable causes. But this one relationship siphoned our resources, perhaps even leaving us bitter, hateful, and disillusioned. We then feel guilty and ashamed of how little we care compared to how much love we initially felt we had to give. And before anybody says we have infinite amounts of compassion, let me just say that yes, in a spiritual sense, in another higher level of consciousness, of course we do. We have infinite amounts of love and compassion and goodness. However, in this physical reality, we all have 24 hours a day, we all have X amount of money to spend and energy to invest. And this is a complete blind spot for many loving people. We need to implement not just love, but love with wisdom. Most people enmeshed in these toxic relationships end up with several chronic illnesses due to this ongoing and unrecognized compassion fatigue. So in addition to waking up to this harsh reality, to confronting the fact that our empathy and kindness was manipulated, we may be left with a tremendous sense of guilt, sadness, or anger that we may go on to project onto the world. And nobody talks about this because it's easier to point the finger and blame. But the point of power is to hold ourselves accountable and to look ourselves in the eye and say, what have I learned from these experiences? I may feel guilty, but what have I learned from this? And how can I make this world a better place? How can I make my relationships, my life better based on the painful education that I received? So if we're able to learn something from these experiences and bring meaning to them, it will help shift that guilt. Because the purpose of guilt is to know when we've made a mistake, but then to learn from that mistake. Perhaps sometimes what we need to learn is that some mistakes cannot be corrected, but rather need to be accepted. Perhaps the lesson is to learn to let go. You are the only one that can find relevance to come to some sort of resolution of your guilt. Perhaps that includes grieving your losses. And another area that we often give ourselves the worst guilt trip is about why didn't we know this earlier? Why didn't we leave sooner? How could we not have known all of this? And we torture ourselves with the question of how could we have been this stupid? And this is a source of unrelenting, torturous guilt. And the only way that we can restore inner peace is by working on self-forgiveness. And again, using our discernment and compassion towards ourselves. We were indoctrinated, we were brainwashed, and we were intentionally manipulated. And guilt was used against us to ensure our enslavement. Undifferentiated guilt is an epidemic that has tortured and killed many loving, kind, highly empathetic men and women. For all of history, humanity was physically enslaved, but today we are psychologically enslaved. We've received so much programming where most of our inner dialogue is so negative. There is such an undercurrent of guilt. It's like we're possessed by this self-flagellating mind program that constantly tells us that we're not good enough and that we should feel guilty for something. See, the first freedom is psychological freedom, because everywhere you go, there you are. All your stories, perceptions, beliefs, interpretations, and you may be at this particular stage of awakening. And when I use the word awakening, it's in reference to awakening to your soul's promptings, where you start observing how we've been spoon-fed and indoctrinated to accept that we are inherently worthless and helpless and should feel ashamed and need to prove that we are lovable. This programming we may have received when we were children, when we lacked the discernment to judge for ourselves whether this feels right for us or not. It could have been by well-meaning teachers and parents and religious figures. You know, it was instilled in us at a very young age where we couldn't think critically. And guilt was a predominant emotion used to condition humanity, enforcing dogmatic beliefs, intentionally using the lowest end of our emotional range, ensuring that we remain there. So the main emotions used to condition humanity into subservience were guilt, shame, and fear. And many of us unquestionably accepted that being burdened by self-condemnation, a self-hatred and self-blame, and to feel bad for simply existing was somehow normal. But just because something's normal doesn't mean that it's right or true. This just sets the ideal environment where we attract pathologically exploitative people who are ready and willing to continue pointing out all our faults, where we remain enslaved, getting their approval and feeling worthwhile. So the use of guilt can be extremely toxic if you're not aware of it. And this is why developing your self-worth and your own inner connection to divine wisdom will stop those people who are utilizing and justifying their intentional use of guilt and shame to interfere with a sacred communication that's between you and your conscience. And those deeply infected by this pervasive mind program will use intimidation and threats to terrorize those seeking psychological freedom. They'll often justify their use of intimidation and aggression, often using their agreed upon concept of God to stop you from escaping those invisible chains that may be palpable to you, that they themselves cannot see are binding them to further suffering, disempowerment, disease. So if you're on the path of awakening, this is quite a predictable pattern of behavior by those who are still conditioned, who are in fear, and who would prefer that you remain on their same level of consciousness. And I'm not saying this out of judgment. I'm wanting to precisely articulate this behavior so you're able to fine-tune your discernment. So if you don't examine those deeply ingrained feelings of guilt, whether they're still relevant and appropriate for you today, this will keep you trapped to past conditioning. You know, your true self, who you authentically are, is basically buried deep under all of this conditioning, indoctrination, authority figures, other people, and institutions telling you who you are. So finding yourself means you're starting to question all you've been indoctrinated to believe and unlearning, peeling off those layers that affected your perception and releasing ourselves from this type of guilt that each of us inherited can be really challenging because most of those battles occur silently within us. But know that by working on your own inner transformation will help ensure that you'll no longer feel vulnerable to others' projections of guilt onto you. When you truly know who you are, when you know what you're guilty of and what you're not guilty of, you will no longer be able to be controlled by guilt. What's been really helpful for me is acknowledging myself for every time I don't instantly react to someone else's use of guilt, or noticing within myself when that self-flagellating program kicks in. So choosing to see an even wider perspective, not taking it so personally, but realizing that what I'm doing is working on freeing myself from generations worth of conditioning that ensured that I remain small. And I want to acknowledge you if you're doing this inner work. It's tough and it can feel really lonely, but this is how we slowly, individually release ourselves from all of that past conditioning.